She pushed the tip of her rusted sewing needle deep into the scarred palm of the Alpha King. Dark blood welled around the jagged oak splinter buried in his flesh. Any normal soldier would have flinched. A conqueror of his brutal reputation, a man rumored to leave enemy strongholds in ashes, should have snapped her fragile wrist for digging into his open wound. Her knuckles brushed his hardened skin as she levered the wood upward. The small cabin offered no sound except the snapping of dry logs in the hearth. She dug the iron needle in again, bracing for a violent strike. Yet, the towering sovereign sat still. His dark eyes tracked her pale fingers, and he never once pulled away. But this terrifying, quiet standoff had begun an hour earlier, when a bleeding warlord first pushed open her wooden door. For a man who had crushed the Appalachian Border Rebellion in 3 days, Brock sat in remarkable silence on a wooden stool. He seemed far too large for the modest room. His broad shoulders blocked the warm light radiating from the hearth. Rain lashed against the window panes. The wind howled through the dark pines outside. Inside the small cabin, the scent of damp wool and old iron hung heavy in the warm air. Christina stood near the fire. She held a simple sewing needle in her trembling fingers. She passed the metal tip through the flames to cleanse it. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She turned to look at the man sitting at her cutting table. His right hand rested flat against the scarred wood. Jagged splinters of an oak lance pierced his palm in 6 places. It was a brutal wound. He was the Alpha King. Men dropped to their knees when they heard his name. Rumors whispered that he had burned 3 rebel strongholds to the ground before dawn. Yet here he was, bleeding onto her linen scraps. He had appeared at her door less than an hour ago, carrying no guards and wearing no crown. The king bore only the blood of his enemies on his leather armor. He had demanded nothing. Stepping inside without a word, he held out his hand and waited. Christina took a slow breath and stepped closer. She wiped the soot from her needle, using a piece of clean cloth. "This will sting, my lord," she murmured. Brock did not speak. His dark eyes remained fixed on her face. He did not glance down at his ruined hand. He only watched the way the firelight caught the edges of her hair. She reached out and took his wrist. The heat radiating from his skin startled her. His pulse beat steady and slow beneath her thumb. He did not possess the frantic energy of a wounded animal. He possessed the calm of a predator at rest. His hands were massive. The calluses on his fingers spoke of years wielding a heavy broadsword. Next to his hardened skin, her pale fingers looked painfully fragile. She felt a sudden tremor of fear. If she caused him too much pain, he could crush her wrist with a single thought. Christina inserted the tip of the needle into his flesh. Finding the edge of the first splinter, she pressed down and levered the wood upward. A bead of dark blood welled to the surface. She waited for him to pull away. Any normal man would have flinched or cursed. Brock did not move. He did not even let out a sharp breath. Christina glanced up through her lashes. He was still watching her, his expression calm and unreadable. She pulled the first piece of oak free and wiped it on the cloth. The silence in the cabin grew thick. The only sound was the snapping of dry wood in the fireplace. She moved to the next shard. This one sat buried near his thumb joint. It required more pressure to dig out the stubborn wood. Her knuckles brushed against his palm as she worked. Every time their skin touched, a strange tension rippled through the quiet room. Christina felt a flush rise in her cheeks. She tried to focus strictly on the task at hand. She dug the needle in again. Brock remained as still as a stone carving. It was unnerving. A sovereign accustomed to blind obedience now yielded to the careful hands of a seamstress. He gave her quiet control over his pain. Minutes bled away. The storm raged outside, rattling the wooden shutters. Inside, time seemed to slow down. The needle slipped under thick skin and tore at resistant fibers. Christina extracted splinter after splinter. Her neck began to ache from bending over the low table. Her fingers cramped from holding the tiny needle. Yet she did not pause. She worked with methodical precision. Half an hour passed, then 45 minutes. Brock never shifted his weight, nor did he break his intense stare. A strange, heavy energy built between them in the cramped space. She paused to wipe a stray strand of hair from her forehead. Her fingers were slick with his blood. Brock watched the subtle gesture. His gaze tracked the movement of her hand with slow deliberation. "Am I hurting you?" she asked softly. Brock slowly shook his head. "No." His voice was a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. It was the first word he had spoken since entering the cabin. The deep resonance of his tone sent a shiver down her spine. Christina returned to her work. Only one fragment remained. It lay lodged deep in the center of his palm. The skin around it had already begun to swell and darken. "This one will be difficult," she warned. She pressed her thumb against the base of his hand to steady it. Driving the needle deep, she sought the bottom edge of the splinter. The wood scraped audibly against something hard as it came loose. Christina winced in sympathy. Pulling the jagged piece of oak free, she dropped it onto the table. She quickly pressed a linen cloth over the wound to stop the bleeding. "That is the last of it," she said. Her voice sounded thin in the heavy silence. She kept her hand pressed firmly over his, applying pressure to the fresh cuts. Brock finally looked down. Staring at her pale fingers resting over his scarred skin, he turned his hand over slowly. He trapped her fingers gently against his palm. The sudden movement made her freeze. He did not grip her tight. He simply let his rough thumb brush over her knuckles. The touch was gentle. It was too gentle for a man of his reputation. Christina forgot how to breathe. The fierce Alpha King was tracing the lines of her hand with quiet reverence. The stark contrast between his lethal strength and this soft gesture left her paralyzed. She did not know how to react. Pulling her hand back, she turned toward the wooden shelf to gather bandages and a jar of yarrow salve. Her hands shook slightly as she picked up the glass jar. When she turned back around, Brock had stood up. The realization of his true height made her take a half step backward. He towered over her, casting a long shadow across the entire room. He took the clean bandage from her hands. Wrapping it around his own palm, he used his teeth to pull the knot tight. He never took his eyes off her face as he secured the linen. "I will repay this debt," he said. The promise hung in the air, heavy with unspoken intent. He turned and walked toward the wooden door. Christina watched him step out into the Appalachian night. The dark rain swallowed his silhouette almost instantly. She stood alone in the quiet cabin. Her heart still pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She walked slowly back to her cutting table to clean the mess. Next to the bloody scraps of linen and the rusted needle, he had left a silver coin. It bore the crest of the royal house. And right beside the coin lay something else. It was an object that made the breath catch in her throat. Beside the silver coin lay a heavy leather vambrace. A blade had sliced cleanly through the thick black hide and ruined the iron buckles. It was a vital piece of battle armor. Leaving it behind on her cutting table was not a careless mistake. It was a silent, deliberate command. He expected her to mend the ruined gear. He fully intended to return. For 3 days, Christina worked on the damaged armor. The Appalachian autumn brought a bitter chill to the mountain air. She sat by her hearth and pushed a heavy iron awl through the stubborn hide. She used her thickest waxed thread to bind the slashed edges together. She tried to keep her mind focused solely on the rigid leather. She tried not to think about the dangerous man who wore it. She failed entirely. The memory of his quiet breathing haunted the empty spaces of her small cabin. On the 4th afternoon, a broad shadow fell across her wooden floorboards. Christina dropped her needle. She looked toward the open doorway. Brock stood on her porch. He did not wear his dark armor today. He wore a simple linen tunic and heavy riding trousers. Without the spikes and steel of his war gear, he looked less like a conquering warlord. Yet the aura of command around him remained suffocating. He seemed to pull all the oxygen from the room simply by existing. "You are early," Christina said softly. She stood up and smoothed her apron. "I have not finished the final strap." "I am not in a hurry," Brock replied. He stepped over the threshold without waiting for an invitation. He moved with a silent grace that defied his massive frame. He did not demand a chair. He simply walked to the corner of the room and sat on a wooden bench near the fire. He stretched his long legs out toward the hearth and crossed his boots. Christina watched him warily. She picked up the vambrace and resumed her work. The silence stretched between them. It was not the hostile silence of a prison. It was the heavy, expectant quiet of a gathering storm. She pulled the wax thread tight. The leather was difficult to pierce. It is thicker than anything I usually mend. It is boiled ironwood hide, Brock said. His deep voice resonated softly against the wooden walls. It needs to stop a broadsword. It appears it failed to do so this time, she pointed out. She immediately bit her tongue. It was a bold thing to say to a king. She braced herself for a flash of anger. Instead, she heard a low sound from the corner. It took her a moment to realize Brack was chuckling. The sound was rough, as if he rarely used his voice for such a thing. The blade did not reach my skin, Brock said. The armor served its purpose, and now you are making it whole again. He stayed for 2 hours. He did not ask her questions about her life. He did not explain the political unrest shaking the borders of his kingdom. He simply watched her hands move over the leather. When the sun dipped behind the western ridge, he stood up, took the mended armor, and walked away into the trees. She thought she would not see him again for a long time. She was wrong. He returned 4 days later. The morning frost had painted the wild grass a stark, brilliant white. Christina was struggling in the yard behind her cabin. She held a dull iron axe, trying to split a stubborn hickory log for the winter fires. The wood refused to yield. She struck the log again, jarring her wrists painfully. A large hand suddenly wrapped over hers on the wooden handle. Christina gasped and spun around. Brock stood right behind her. She had not heard him approach over the dry, frosted leaves. The scent of pine needles, leather, and wood smoke washed over her. He was standing far too close. "Give me the axe," he murmured. "I can manage," she said breathlessly. She tried to pull the handle back. Brock did not let go. His grip was an iron vise. "You will fracture your wrist. Let go of the wood." He did not shout, but the quiet authority in his tone left no room for debate. Christina released the handle and took a step back. She rubbed her aching forearms. Brock stepped up to the chopping block. He did not swing wildly. He lifted the heavy axe with one hand, tested its weight, and brought it down. The hickory log split cleanly in half with a sharp crack. He picked up another log and repeated the motion. Christina stood frozen near the porch. She watched the fluid flex of his broad shoulders under his tunic. He swung the axe with mechanical, devastating precision. This was a man whose strength was known to break fortress gates. Men wrote songs about the terror of his wrath on the battlefield. Yet here he was in the quiet Appalachian dawn, channeling that terrifying power into chopping firewood for a seamstress. The sheer contrast made her heart ache with a strange, unnamed emotion. He worked for an hour until a massive pile of split wood rested against the side of her cabin. Sweat gleamed faintly on his neck. He leaned the axe against the wooden block and turned to look at her. Christina hurried inside and returned with a clay cup of fresh water. She offered it to him. Her fingers trembled slightly. Brock took the cup, his knuckles brushed against hers. The brief contact sent a jolt of heat straight up her arm. He drank the water in slow, deep swallows. A single drop escaped his lips and traced a line down his strong jaw. Christina found herself staring at the rugged curve of his throat. She forced her eyes away, feeling a sudden flush of heat in her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered. "The wood is green," Brock noted, handing the cup back. "It will smoke when you burn it. I will bring you seasoned oak next time." He spoke of the future so casually. He spoke as if this arrangement was already a permanent fixture in his life. Over the next 2 weeks, his visits became a steady rhythm in her isolated existence. He always arrived unannounced. Sometimes he brought a brace of wild rabbits he had hunted in the Shenandoah valleys. Other times, he brought nothing at all. He would simply sit by her hearth while she cooked or sewed. The king of the realm was using her humble home as a sanctuary. One evening, a fierce autumn rain battered the roof of the cabin. The temperature had dropped sharply. Christina sat near the fire, mending a torn wool blanket. Brock sat in the large wooden chair opposite her. He had been staring into the flames for a long time. The harsh lines of his face seemed to soften in the golden firelight. "You do not ask why I come here," Brock said suddenly. The quiet words cut through the sound of the falling rain. Christina did not look up from her needle. "It is not my place to question a king." "I am not a king in this room," he replied. The raw honesty in his voice made her pause. She finally looked across the hearth. Brock was watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. His dark eyes held a profound weariness. "For 10 years, people have looked at me and seen only a weapon," Brock continued. His voice dropped to a low, rough whisper. They look for a shield against the rebels. They look for a blade to strike down their enemies. When you look at me, Christina, you only see a man sitting in your chair." Hearing her name fall from his lips sent a shiver down her spine. It was the first time he had spoken it aloud. He made the simple word sound like a sacred oath. She set her sewing aside. She wanted to bridge the physical distance between them. She wanted to reach out and touch the dark hair falling across his forehead. She wanted to offer him the comfort he clearly lacked in his grand stone fortress. She took a slow breath and leaned forward. "Brock?" she began softly. Before she could finish the sentence, the rhythmic thud of heavy hooves echoed through the rain. The sound grew rapidly louder. It was not a single rider. It was a full detachment of heavy cavalry. The horses splashed violently through the mud of her front yard. Armor clattered against steel weapons. The noise shattered the fragile, quiet world inside the cabin. Brock did not jump, but his entire demeanor changed in a fraction of a second. The weary man vanished. The lethal Alpha King returned. His spine straightened. His eyes went hard and cold. He stood up slowly, his hand resting instinctively where his sword would normally hang. A loud, commanding voice shouted over the roaring wind outside. "Secure the perimeter!" The king's tracker followed his trail to this hovel. "Break the door down if you must." Christina froze in terror. She looked at the wooden door, then back at the towering man standing in her living room. The royal army had found him, and they believed she was holding him captive. The heavy oak door rattled violently on its iron hinges. Outside, in the freezing rain, a soldier raised a steel battle axe to splinter the wood. Before the blade could strike, Brock reached out and threw the iron latch open. A gust of wind howled into the small cabin, blowing out the candles. The soldiers on the porch froze. They stared at their sovereign in stunned disbelief. Brock stood in the doorway, barefoot and wearing only his simple linen tunic. He carried no weapon. Yet, he radiated a lethal, suffocating authority that made the armed men instinctively step backward into the thick mud. "Lower your weapons," Brock said. He did not shout over the storm. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble that cut effortlessly through the pouring rain. The royal guards scrambled to sheathe their swords. A tall man pushed his way through the armored ranks. He wore the silver crest of a high general on his chest plate. Falling to his knees in the mud before the wooden porch, the general bowed his head. "My lord," the general gasped, rain dripping heavily from his helmet, "we tracked your path from the valley stronghold. When you did not return for 3 days, the High Council feared the rebels had ambushed you." "I am not a child who needs a nursemaid," Brock replied coldly. "Withdraw your men from this yard." The general hesitated, glancing past the king into the dim cabin. "Sire, the High Council convenes tomorrow at Roanoke Keep. The northern lords grow increasingly restless. They demand the political alliance be sealed. Lady Genevieve of House Vance awaits your arrival. The realm needs a queen to ensure stability." Christina stood hidden in the shadows near her hearth. The general's words struck her chest like physical blows. Lady Genevieve, a queen, the realm. The warm, intimate bubble she had shared with Brock over the past few weeks shattered in an instant. The harsh, unforgiving reality of his world flooded into her small room. He was not just a weary man seeking solace by her fire. He was the sovereign ruler of a fractured kingdom, bound by duties she could barely comprehend. Brock's jaw tightened. He glanced back over his broad shoulder, meeting Christina's eyes through the shadows. He saw the immediate shift in her posture. He saw the heavy, protective walls she was suddenly building behind her pale eyes. "I will ride for Roanoke at dawn," Brock told the general. "Set up camp down the western ridge. Do not approach this property again tonight." The general bowed his head and signaled his men. The heavy cavalry turned their mounts and rode away into the dark Appalachian trees, leaving the yard empty once more. Brock pushed the heavy door closed, shutting out the storm. The silence in the cabin felt entirely different now. It was no longer a shared, comforting quiet. It felt heavy and suffocating. He took a slow step toward Christina. She immediately stepped backward, putting her wooden cutting table between them. She picked up a folded linen shirt, pretending to busy her hands with the fabric. "Christina," he said softly. "You should return to your men, my lord," she said. She kept her voice flat and even, stripping it of all the warmth she had shown him earlier that evening. "It is not fitting for a king to linger in a place like this." The formal title made him flinch. The subtle movement was barely visible, but she caught it, his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. "Do not do this," Duke warned. His deep voice grew thick with frustration. "Do not let their politics build a wall between us." "The wall is already there," she answered, keeping her eyes fixed on the table. "It has always been there. You have a kingdom to secure. You have a noble bride waiting for you at the keep. I am a seamstress who mends torn leather. We do not belong in the same world." Brock crossed the room in 2 long strides. He stopped right at the edge of the wooden table. Reaching out, he caught her chin. He lifted her face, forcing her to look at him. His calloused fingers were rough against her skin, but his touch remained incredibly gentle. "I do not want the Vance woman," he stated. His dark eyes searched hers with fierce, desperate intensity. "I care nothing for the demands of a frightened council." "Your kingdom cares," she whispered. Her heart pounded violently against his fingers. "And you are their king. You cannot pretend otherwise. Not anymore." She pulled her chin away from his grip. Turning her back to him, she walked toward the hearth to stoke the dying embers. She listened to the tense silence stretching across the room. After a long minute, she heard the front door open and close. He was gone, leaving only the scent of rain and leather behind. Over the next week, the air in the Appalachian Mountains grew bitter and freezing. Frost hardened the mud around her cabin. The familiar isolation of her life returned. Yet it felt far heavier than before. Brock came back 3 days later. Christina saw his tall silhouette approaching through the distant tree line. Panic seized her chest. She quickly locked her front door and blew out her candles. Sitting on the floor in the dark, she hugged her knees tightly to her chest. She listened to him knock on the heavy wood. She heard his low voice call her name through the door. She clamped a hand over her own mouth to muffle her jagged breathing. After a long time, his heavy footsteps faded away into the forest. It tore at her heart to ignore him. She knew she was doing the right thing. A violent political world surrounded the Alpha King. If she allowed herself to be drawn into his orbit, the High Lords would crush her without a second thought. A king could not marry a commoner. She would only be a fleeting distraction, a vulnerable target for his many enemies. He tried again 2 days later. He did not knock this time. He simply left a woven basket of winter apples and fresh bread on her porch. Christina brought the food inside once he was gone, but she did not leave a message in return. She kept her wooden shutters tightly closed. By the end of the week, the silence from the woods felt permanent. The heavy snowfall had covered his footprints in the yard. She convinced herself he had finally accepted her silent rejection. He had gone to Roanoke Keep to marry his noble lady. It was the only logical outcome. On the crisp morning of the winter solstice, a harsh knocking rattled her door. Christina wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron and opened the heavy wood. It was not Brock. 2 royal guards stood on her porch, wearing the polished silver armor of the king's elite vanguard. A sleek black carriage with the royal crest waited in the dirt road beyond her fence. The dark horses stamped their hooves in the snow. "Christina of the Valley?" the lead guard asked. His tone held no warmth or respect. "Yes," she replied cautiously, clutching the edge of the door. The guard unrolled a heavy parchment sealed with black wax. He held it out to her. "By direct decree of the sovereign, you are summoned to Roanoke Keep," the soldier announced. "You are to attend the winter solstice banquet tonight. A royal carriage has been provided for your transport." Christina stared at the black wax seal. Her hands began to shake. "There must be a mistake. I am not a noble. I do not attend state banquets." "It is not an invitation," the guard stated. He rested a heavy hand on the hilt of his broadsword. "It is a royal command. You will gather your cloak and enter the carriage now, or we will place you inside it by force." She looked past the armored mare at the looming black carriage. The king had not given up. He had not accepted her rejection. He had simply changed his tactics. If she would not let him into her quiet world, he was going to drag her out of the shadows and force her directly into the glaring, dangerous light of his court. The black carriage rattled across the stone bridge. Iron wheels ground against the ancient cobblestones of Roanoke Keep. The fortress loomed against the winter sky. Torches cast long shadows against the gray walls. Christina sat frozen on the velvet seat. She wore her best garment. It was a simple green dress. She had stitched it herself using leftover fabric from a merchant's cloak. Against the brutal splendor of the royal stronghold, it looked like a beggar's rag. A guard opened the carriage door. He gestured sharply toward the grand entrance. Christina stepped down into the freezing wind. She kept her head bowed and followed a line of minor nobles into the great hall. The sheer scale of the room stole the breath from her lungs. Hundreds of beeswax candles burned in iron chandeliers. The scent of roasted meat and expensive perfumes choked the warm air. Lords and ladies moved across the polished floor in a sea of silk. They wore jewels that could buy her small cabin 10 times over. Christina retreated immediately to the far edge of the room. She found a quiet alcove behind a stone pillar. She pressed her back against the cold masonry. She wanted to vanish into the stonework. She wanted to be back in the Appalachian woods. A sudden murmur rippled through the crowd. The heavy doors at the end of the hall swung open. A woman entered the room. She was surrounded by a retinue of armored knights. It was Lady Genevieve of House Vance. She wore a gown of spun silver and white fur. Her blonde hair fell in perfect waves over her shoulders. She moved with the predatory grace of a woman raised for power. The northern lords bowed deeply as she passed. Christina watched the noblewoman. A heavy stone sank in her chest. This was the world Brock belonged to. This was the queen his people demanded. Genevieve was beautiful and perfectly suited to stand beside a warlord. A loud horn blasted from the upper balcony. The low hum of conversation stopped instantly. The great hall fell silent. Brock walked through the high archway. He did not wear the linen tunic of the mountains. He wore the formal attire of the Alpha King. His broad chest was clad in dark leather and black steel. A thick cloak of wolf fur draped over his shoulders. A crown of jagged iron sat upon his dark hair. He looked terrifying. He looked like the legend that burned enemy cities to ash. The entire hall dropped to their knees. A wave of silk and velvet collapsed onto the stone floor. Christina sank to her knees behind her pillar. Her hands trembled against the cold floorboards. She kept her eyes fixed on the gray stone. "Rise," Brock commanded. His voice echoed like thunder across the vaulted ceiling. The nobles stood up in unison. The high general from the cabin stepped forward. He gestured toward Lady Genevieve. The noblewoman smiled. She took a confident step toward the king. She expected him to offer his arm. She expected him to lead her to the high table. Brock did not even look at her. His dark eyes scanned the massive room. He dismissed the glittering lords and the bowing generals. His gaze swept over the velvet gowns and the polished armor. He was hunting for something specific. His eyes locked onto the shadows behind the stone pillar. Christina felt his gaze like a physical impact. Her breath hitched. She tried to step further back into the darkness. She wanted the shadows to swallow her whole. Brock stepped down from the raised dais. He ignored the high general. He ignored Lady Genevieve. He walked straight into the crowd of stunned nobles. The lords and ladies scrambled out of his path. They parted like water before a plunging stone. No one dared to speak. The thud of his leather boots echoed loudly in the silent room. He walked a straight line across the hall. He did not stop until he reached the dark alcove. He stopped 3 feet away from Christina. The crowd stared in shocked silence. They saw their ruthless warlord standing before a pale girl in a plain dress. They whispered behind their hands. The hostility in their eyes burned like acid. Brock did not care about their whispers. He only looked at Christina. The hard lines of his face softened slightly. The terrifying king vanished, leaving only the man who chopped her firewood. "You ignored my apples," he said. His voice was a low rumble. Christina felt the heat rise in her cheeks. She kept her eyes on his boots. I did not ask for them, my lord. You locked your door against me. I was protecting myself, she whispered. Her hands gripped the fabric of her skirt. I do not belong here. You know I do not belong here. Please let me go home. You are here because I willed it, Brock replied. I grew tired of standing in the freezing rain. He closed the distance between them. He did not ask for permission. He reached out and offered his right hand. The thick scar from the oak splinter was clearly visible across his palm. Dance with me, he commanded softly. A collective gasp echoed from the nearby nobles. A king did not dance with commoners. He certainly did not ignore a high-born lady to touch a peasant. It was a severe insult to House Vance. It was a dangerous rejection of the High Council's plans. Christina stared at his scarred hand. If I take your hand, they will hate me. They already hate what they do not understand, Brock said. Let them hate. I only care about you. The raw honesty in his tone shattered her defenses. She could fight his authority. She could not fight the quiet vulnerability in his dark eyes. Her hands shook as she raised her arm. She placed her small fingers into his massive palm. Brock tightened his grip. His touch was warm and firm. He pulled her gently out of the shadows. He led her away from the stone pillar and into the center of the grand floor. The musicians scrambled to play a slow waltz. The melody drifted nervously through the tense air. No other couples joined them on the floor. The lords and ladies stood in a wide circle. They watched the king and the seamstress with calculating eyes. Brock placed his left hand on her waist. He pulled her close. The heat of his body radiated through his heavy armor. Christina rested her free hand on his broad shoulder. She felt the hard muscle shift beneath the wolf fur. They began to move. Brock guided her steps with surprising grace. For a man accustomed to the brutal chaos of a battlefield, he moved with a smooth rhythm. "Keep your eyes on me," Brock murmured. He leaned his head down, bringing his lips close to her ear. "Do not look at them." "They are looking at me," Christina breathed. "They look at me like I am a disease." "They look at you with fear," he corrected. His thumb traced a slow circle against her waist. "They realize they cannot control me. They realize you have more power over me than their entire army." The words sent a violent shiver down her spine. It was a terrifying confession. He was giving her a weapon that could destroy him. He was placing his reign in the hands of a woman who mended leather. Christina finally raised her head. She looked into his eyes. The weariness she had seen in her cabin was gone. A possessive fire burned in his gaze. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Because I spent 10 years surrounded by monsters and cowards," Brock said. "You are the only real thing I have touched in a decade. I will not let you hide in the woods. I will not pretend. I do not want you." The music swelled. He pulled her closer, eliminating the space between their bodies. Christina stopped trying to fight him. She surrendered to the warmth of his chest. She let the music carry them across the polished floor. For a few fleeting minutes, the hostile crowd disappeared. There was only the steady beat of his heart against her palm. The song eventually faded into silence. Brock slowly came to a halt. He did not release her waist. He kept her anchored against his side. The High General stepped onto the floor. His face was rigid with cold rage. Behind him, Lady Genevieve turned sharply on her heel and stormed out of the great hall. Her silver gown trailed angrily across the stone. The northern lords whispered frantically among themselves. Their eyes darted toward the king. The romantic bubble burst. The harsh reality of the royal court crashed down upon them. "My lord," the general said, his voice shook with anger. "The council requires a private audience. Immediately. This display has caused severe offense to our vital allies." Brock looked over Christina's head. His dark eyes locked onto the general. The quiet man vanished. The lethal Alpha King returned. "I will join the council in 10 minutes, Brock stated flatly. "Prepare the war room." The general bowed stiffly and marched away. Brock looked down at Christina. He released her waist, but he caught her hand. He brushed his thumb over her knuckles. "I must attend to the wolves," he told her softly. "Stay here, do not leave the hall. I have ordered my personal guard to watch the doors." He turned and walked toward the heavy doors at the back of the room. Christina watched him go. She felt entirely exposed in the massive hall. The crowd of nobles stared at her. Their eyes were no longer just hostile, they were dangerous. A slender man detached himself from the shadows near the tapestry. He wore the dark velvet of the Northern Territories. He walked slowly toward Christina. A mocking smile twisted his lips. He carried a silver goblet in his hand. "So," the man sneered, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, "you are the little splinter that has crippled the king's judgment." He took another step closer. His hand reached toward the collar of her plain dress. The man reached toward the collar of her green dress. His fingers never touched the rough fabric. A steel gauntlet locked around his wrist. The northern lord gasped. Captain Torin of the Vanguard stood beside Christina. He twisted the noble's arm backward. A loud pop echoed in the alcove. "The king ordered no one to touch her," Torin stated. He shoved the lord away. The injured man fell against the stone pillar. He clutched his ruined shoulder. Christina trembled. She looked at the armored captain. "Please," she whispered. "I cannot stay here. They will kill me." Torin gave a grim nod. "The keep is a viper's nest. I will fetch the king." Brock returned moments later. His dark eyes blazed with fury when he saw the kneeling lord. He looked at Christina. He saw the pure terror in her pale face. The political victory he had planned meant nothing now. "Take her back to the mountain," Brock ordered Torin. His rough voice shook with suppressed rage. "Post 50 men in the woods around her cabin. Kill anyone who crosses the perimeter. I will tear this council apart. Then I will come for her." He turned to Christina. He touched her cheek. His thumb brushed away a stray tear. "Wait for me." She nodded. She let Torin lead her out the side doors. She left the glittering nightmare behind. 2 weeks passed. The Appalachian winter gripped the mountain valley. Christina sat by her hearth. The silver coin and the mended armor sat on her wooden table. She touched the cold metal often. The memory of the grand ballroom felt like a distant dream. She remembered the steady beat of his heart. She remembered his fierce declaration. The royal guards kept their distance. Torin positioned his men far from her yard. They honored the king's command for her privacy. They vanished into the snowy landscape. Their invisible presence brought her little comfort. On a crisp morning, her supply of yarrow root ran low. She needed the bitter herb for winter teas. She wrapped a wool cloak around her shoulders. She grabbed a woven basket and an iron knife. She stepped off her wooden porch. She walked toward the Shenandoah pines. The ancient forest bordered her property. Snow covered the forest floor. The pine branches blocked the morning sun. The air felt cold and still. Christina hummed a soft tune. She searched the bases of the old trees. She dug through the snow with her bare hands. She found a cluster of green leaves. She used her iron knife to cut the sturdy roots. She dropped the dirt-covered herbs into her basket. She walked deeper into the timber. The towering trunks swallowed the light. She lost sight of her wooden roof. She knew this forest well. She had foraged these paths for years. A strange sound broke the silence. A crow shrieked in the high canopy. The harsh noise startled her. She paused. She listened to the woods. The normal rustle of small animals was missing. The forest held its breath. A primal instinct flared in her chest. She stood up slowly. She looked at the snowy path ahead. A heavy footprint broke the pristine surface. It was not the neat track of a royal guard. It was the jagged print of a ragged boot. It pointed directly toward her position. Christina took a slow step backward. Her boot snapped dry twig. The sharp noise cracked like a whip. A dark figure stepped out from behind an oak trunk. He wore rusted chainmail. A gray cloak hung from his shoulders. A jagged scar crossed his face. He held a Naust broadsword. He smiled. His teeth were brown and rotting. "Going somewhere, little bird?" the man rasped. Christina spun around to run. 3 men stepped onto the path behind her. They blocked her escape route. They carried iron axes and wooden crossbows. They wore the broken crest of the defeated rebellion. She was surrounded. Torin and his guards were stationed near the cabin. They were too far away. They could not hear her scream through the thick timber. "The royal hounds guard your house," the scarred leader said. He walked slowly toward her. His boots crunched in the snow. "They guard the empty yard. They forgot to guard the deep woods." Christina dropped her woven basket. The yarrow roots scattered across the snow. She gripped her iron knife. Her knuckles turned white. It was a pathetic weapon against armed men. She refused to drop it. She refused to beg. "What do you want?" she demanded. Her voice shook. The leader laughed. The harsh sounds scraped against the trees. "The king burned our fortress. He slaughtered our brothers in the valley. We wanted his head. We could not breach his iron walls, but a scout brought us a very interesting rumor." He stopped 5 feet away. He looked her up and down. His gaze made her skin crawl. "They say the great warlord abandoned Mobile Bride," the rebel mocked. "They say he danced with a peasant girl. They say he threatened his own council to protect a seamstress in the mountains." The leader raised his notched sword. He pointed the rusty tip at her throat. "We came to see if the rumor was true. If we cut you into pieces and leave you on his throne, will the king weep?" "He will hunt you down," Christina whispered. She held the iron knife steady. "He will burn you alive." "He has to find us first," the rebel sneered. "Grab her, break her arms if she fights." The 3 men lunged forward. Christina slashed blindly with her knife. The blade caught a rebel's forearm. He cursed and backhanded her across the face. The heavy blow sent her crashing into the snow. The iron knife flew from her hand. The cold snow burned her cheek. She tasted blood in her mouth. A heavy boot slammed onto her back. The rebel pinned her to the frozen ground. He grabbed her dark hair. He yanked her head backward. The leader stepped forward. He raised his rusty sword to strike. Christina squeezed her eyes shut. She braced for the fatal blow. She thought of Brock. She thought of his warm hand. The forest exploded. A deafening roar shattered the silent timber. It was not the shout of a man. It was the furious bellow of a savage beast. The sheer volume vibrated through the frozen ground. The rebel holding her hair froze in pure terror. The leader looked up. His arrogant smile vanished. The rusty sword slipped from his trembling hand. Above them, the pine branches snapped like dry kindling. A massive shadow blotted out the pale winter sun. The canopy above them shook violently. Snow rained down from the ancient branches in heavy clumps. A massive figure dropped from the high timber. Brock landed on the frozen earth with devastating force. The impact sent a heavy tremor through the ground. He did not bring a royal battalion. He carried no steel shield. He wore only his dark traveling cloak and leather armor. He had abandoned his mount somewhere in the valley. He had tracked her through the wild mountains using pure instinct. The rebel holding Christina's hair released her instantly. He stumbled backward into a thick snowbank. He scrambled a well across the frozen ground. Christina pushed herself up on her elbows. She gasped for cold air. She watched the violent nightmare unfold. Brock stood up slowly from his crouched landing. He did not draw a heavy weapon. He did not need one. The lethal energy radiating from his tall frame felt entirely physical. The winter air around him grew heavy. It became difficult to draw breath. He looked at the 4 men. His dark eyes held no human mercy. They burned with a cold, terrifying promise. The rebel leader recovered his scattered wits first. He raised his rusty broadsword with shaking hands. He let out a desperate battle cry. He charged at the unarmed king. Brock did not dodge the clumsy attack. He stepped directly into the man's path. The leader swung the heavy blade toward his broad chest. Brock raised his left arm. He caught the descending steel with his bare, leather-clad hand. The rebel froze in sudden shock. The sharp edge bit into the reinforced glove, but it did not pierce the tough hide. Brock twisted his massive wrist. The rusty steel snapped with a loud crack. He tossed the broken metal aside.
Reaching forward, Brock grabbed the leader by the front of his rusted chainmail. He lifted the heavy man off the ground using only one strong arm. The rebel kicked his leather boots frantically in the air. He clawed at the iron grip holding his armor. Brock did not say a single word. He hurled the man across the snowy clearing. The leader flew through the cold air and crashed into a thick pine trunk. He slumped to the snow, unconscious. The remaining 3 men stared at their fallen commander. Panic seized their dirty faces. They realized the old legends were true. This was the warlord who pooped stone fortresses. This was the Alpha King. One rebel raised a wooden crossbow. His rough hands trembled violently. He struggled to load an iron bolt into the groove. Brock moved faster than humanly possible. He crossed the snowy clearing in 3 long strides. He slammed his broad shoulder into the man's chest. The physical impact sounded like a falling oak tree. The rebel flew backward through the winter air. He tumbled wildly across the snowbank and lay still. The last 2 men dropped their heavy weapons. They did not try to fight the king. They turned and ran blindly into the deep woods. They crashed through the thick bushes. They abandoned their desperate cause to save their own lives. Silence rushed back into the dark forest. The harsh shrieks of the mountain crows faded. The only sound was the winter wind howling through the pine needles. Brock stood in the center of the ruined clearing. His broad chest heaved with heavy breaths. The lethal fury still rolled off his shoulders in invisible waves. He looked at the unconscious men scattered across the white snow. He seemed ready to tear the very trees from the earth. Christina remained frozen on the cold ground. Her heart hammered against her sore ribs. She had known he was a powerful kill. She had seen him command Rothal armies. But seeing this raw, untamed violence was vastly different. He was a force of nature. She felt a cold prickle of genuine fear. This was the dark monster her people whispered about. This was the harsh ruler who ordered executions without a second thought. He was chaos wearing a royal crown. Brock slowly turned around. His dark cloak swirled in the mountain wind. He looked down at the trampled snow. He saw the scattered yarrow roots. He saw her fallen woven basket. Then, his dark eyes finally found Christina.
She sat in the white snow. Her dark hair hung in wild tangles around her shoulders. A dark bruise formed on her pale cheek where the rebel had struck her. She clutched her wool cloak tightly across her chest. She looked small and fragile against the vast winter landscape. The change in the Alpha King was immediate. The terrifying warlord vanished into the cold air. The lethal tension drained from his broad shoulders. He dropped to his knees in the white snow. He did not care about the damp cold soaking his leather trousers. He crawled the last few feet toward her. He moved with slow hesitation. He kept his hands open and clearly visible. He treated her like a startled bird ready to take flight. "Christina," he rasped. His deep voice shook with raw emotion. He reached out to touch her pale face. His large hand hovered an inch from her bruised cheek. He stopped himself abruptly. He remembered his own destructive strength. He remembered the brutal violence she had just witnessed. He pulled his scarred hand back. He curled his thick fingers into a tight fist. He rested his hands on his own knees. He kept a careful, measured distance. "Did they break the skin?" he asked. He kept his deep voice deliberately soft. He tried to hide the lingering rage in his rough tone. Christina stared at his rugged face. She looked past the terrifying legend. She saw the raw panic in his dark eyes. The most dangerous man in the realm was terrified of frightening her. She slowly shook her head. "No, I am unharmed." Her soft voice sounded thin in the quiet woods. She tried to sit up straighter in the deep snow. A sharp pain flared in her bruised ribs. She winced slightly and wrapped her arms around her waist. Brock saw the subtle movement. His strong jaw clenched tight. A dangerous shadow crossed his handsome face. He looked back toward the unconscious rebel near the pine tree. He seemed ready to stand up and finish the fight. "Brock," she called out softly. He snapped his fierce attention back to her. The dark fury faded away once more. "I am all right," she whispered. She unclasped her slender arms from her waist. She took a slow, deep breath to prove it. Brock let out a long, ragged exhale. He lowered his dark head. He stared at the white snow between his leather boots. He looked like an exhausted man who had just outrun a mountain avalanche. "Torin sent a fast rider," Brock murmured. He kept his dark eyes on the ground. "He said you went into the deep woods. He said the border patrol found strange tracks near the secure perimeter. I thought—" He did not finish the dark sentence. The unspoken fear hung heavily in the freezing air. He had abandoned his important royal duties. He had ridden his strong horse to the point of collapse. He had run through the mountain snow to reach her in time. He looked up again. The naked vulnerability in his expression stole her breath. He possessed the vast power to crush kingdoms. He possessed the immense wealth to buy armies. Yet kneeling in the Appalachian snow, he looked broken. Christina realized a profound truth. The royal council did not control him. The rebel armies could not defeat him. She was his only true weakness. She did not feel cold fear anymore. She felt a deep, overwhelming ache in her chest. She reached out with her cold, trembling hand. She touched the rough leather of his dark sleeve. Brock froze at the unexpected contact. He stared at her pale fingers resting against his dark armor. He slowly raised his dark eyes to meet hers. The unspoken tension between them reached a critical breaking point. "You came for me," she whispered. Brock turned his large hand over. He caught her small fingers in his rough palm. He did not pull away. He held onto her hand like a drowning man clutching a wooden lifeline. "I will always come for you," he vowed. His rough voice broke on the final word. The harsh winter wind blew across the ruined clearing. It rustled the dark pine branches. The dangerous forest felt peaceful once again. The Alpha King knelt in the snow. He bowed his dark head over her small hand. He pressed his cold forehead against her pale knuckles. He surrendered his royal pride to a mountain seamstress. Christina felt a warm tear fall against her cold skin. It did not belong to her. She looked down at the fierce warlord kneeling at her feet. She freed her hand from his tight grip. She reached toward his rugged face. She brushed her fingertips against his jaw. She felt the rough stubble on his skin. She guided his heavy head upward. "Take me home," she told him softly. Brock nodded. He stood up effortlessly. He gathered her gently into his strong arms. He lifted her from the cold snow as if she weighed nothing at all. Christina rested her tired head against his broad chest. She listened to the frantic, heavy rhythm of his heartbeat. He carried her away from the ruined clearing. He did not look back at the fallen men. He navigated the dark pine forest with confident, steady strides. The bitter wind bit at her exposed cheeks. Brock shifted his grip. He pulled his heavy wolf fur cloak around her slender shoulders. He shielded her from the harsh Appalachian winter. They walked in deep silence. The heavy boots crunched steadily through the fresh snow. Christina closed her eyes. She felt the lingering tremors of adrenaline leaving his large body. The terrifying warlord was gone. The quiet man from her wooden hearth had returned. They reached the edge of the dark tree line. The small wooden cabin came into view. Smoke drifted lazily from the stone chimney. Captain Torin and a dozen armored guards stood near the front porch. They drew their steel swords when they saw movement in the trees. Torin lowered his weapon instantly. He saw his fierce king carrying the injured seamstress. The royal guards parted like a metal sea. They bowed their heads in respectful silence. They recognized the profound shift in their sovereign. Brock ignored his loyal soldiers. He walked straight up the wooden steps. He kicked the heavy front door open with his leather boot. He carried Christina over the threshold and into the warm sanctuary of her home. He kicked the door shut behind them. The harsh winter world vanished. They were finally alone. Brock carried her to the wooden chair by the hearth. He set her down with extreme care. He treated her like spun glass. He turned back to the heavy door. He dropped the iron latch into place. The sharp click sealed them inside. The harsh winter storm remained outside. He walked back to the fireplace. He threw 3 dry logs onto the dying embers. The flames caught quickly. Golden light flooded the small room. He knelt on the floorboards beside her chair. He did not remove his dark armor. He reached for the clasp of her wool cloak. His large fingers fumbled slightly with the silver pin. "Let me," Christina said softly. She unfastened the cloak. She let the heavy fabric fall over the back of the chair. She wore only her simple green dress. Brock looked at the bruise on her cheek. His jaw tightened. A dangerous shadow crossed his face. He hated his inability to protect her from that initial blow. "Does anything else hurt?" he asked. His rough voice sounded strained. "My ribs," she admitted. "When I fell." Brock sucked in a sharp breath. He reached forward with hesitant hands. He rested his palms gently against her sides. He pressed his thumbs along her ribcage through the fabric of her dress. "Nothing is broken," he murmured. He let out a ragged sigh. "You will be sore for a few days." He pulled his hands back. He sat back on his heels. He looked exhausted. The fierce adrenaline had left his massive frame. "You should not have come alone," Christina told him. "Torin has 50 men. You rode without a royal guard." "I could not wait for the vanguard," Brock replied. He kept his dark eyes on the wooden floor. "The council trapped me in the war room. They brought maps and treaties. They talked for hours." He shook his dark head. A bitter laugh escaped his throat. "I sat on the Iron Throne," he continued. "I listened to their political demands, but my mind remained in this cabin. I realized I was suffocating in that stone keep." Christina watched him confess his weakness. He was the most feared man in the realm, yet he knelt on her floor and spoke of his own terror. "Then the messenger arrived," Brock said. His voice dropped to a hoarse whisper. "He said you were missing. He said rebel tracks circled your woods." He finally looked up at her. The raw pain in his eyes made her breath catch. "The world stopped," he stated simply. "The war room vanished. The council ceased to exist. There was only the blinding need to find you." Christina felt a warm tear slide down her unbruised cheek. She reached out. She placed her small hand on his broad shoulder. "I am here," she reassured him. Brock covered her hand with his own. He pressed her palm against his neck. He wanted to feel her pulse. He needed physical proof that she was alive. "I bring you nothing but danger," he confessed bitterly. "I tried to stay away. I tried to leave you in peace, but I am a selfish man." "You chopped my firewood," she reminded him softly. "You brought me winter apples. You did not act like a warlord." "It was a temporary illusion," Brock said. He closed his eyes. "The violence always follows me. Those men in the forest wanted to hurt you, to punish me." "They failed," she answered firmly. She stood up from the wooden chair. She ignored the dull ache in her side. She walked to the small table in the corner. She poured fresh water into a clay bowl. She picked up a clean linen cloth. She walked back to where he knelt on the floor. She dipped the cloth into the cool water. "Look at me," she instructed. Brock opened his eyes. He looked up at her. She gently pressed the wet cloth to his rugged face. She wiped the dried mud from his cheekbone. She cleaned a small smear of dirt from his strong jaw. He remained silent. He allowed her to tend to him. He surrendered his fierce autonomy to her gentle hands. "You hold too much power over me," he murmured. "I am only a seamstress," she replied. She rinsed the cloth in the clay bowl. "You are my tether to humanity," he corrected. He reached up and grasped her wrists. He did not use forceful pressure. He merely stopped her movements. He pulled her hands away from his face. He stood up slowly. He towered over her in the small cabin. The physical difference between them remained vast, yet the emotional distance had vanished. He walked toward the small cutting table. He saw the silver coin he had left weeks ago. It rested beside a folded linen shirt. "You kept it," he murmured. "I kept everything," she answered. Brock turned around. "I spent 10 years building a kingdom of fear. I thought a cold heart was a strong shield. I thought mercy was a fatal flaw." He pulled her a single step closer. The heat of his body radiated through his dark armor. "Then you pulled a splinter from my hand," he whispered. "You did not tremble in terror. You only showed me quiet kindness." Christina looked up into his face. She saw the profound depth of his devotion. It was not a fleeting royal fancy. It was a permanent, unbreakable bond. "You are not a monster in this room," she told him. Her voice rang with absolute conviction. "You are just Brock." Hearing his given name fall from her lips shattered his final restraint. He wrapped his strong arms around her waist. He pulled her flush against his broad chest. He buried his face in the crook of her neck. He breathed in the scent of her skin. Christina wrapped her arms round his wide shoulders. She buried her fingers in his dark hair. She held him tightly. She offered him the sanctuary he desperately craved. They stood locked in a quiet embrace. The fire popped and hissed in the stone hearth. The Appalachian wind howled against the wooden shutters. Inside the cabin, the Alpha King found his peace. He held his seamstress like a sacred relic. He displayed a quiet reverence that defied his brutal reputation. "I will not return to the keep without you," Brock swore softly. His warm breath brushed against her skin. "I will abdicate the throne before I leave you here." Christina pulled back slightly. She looked at his resolute face. "The kingdom needs you," she argued gently. "The northern lords will rebel. The realm will tear itself apart." "Let it burn," he answered without hesitation. "I only rule to protect what is mine, and you are mine." It was a dangerous, possessive claim, yet it did not frighten her. It filled her with a strange, fierce joy. She belonged to the Alpha King. He belonged to her. He lifted his hand. He cupped her cheek with gentle reverence. He leaned down. He pressed his lips softly against her forehead. The touch was a silent promise of eternal devotion. Christina closed her eyes. She savored the quiet moment. She knew the political world would eventually demand an answer. She knew the High Council would not accept their defiance. For now, she did not care. She leaned against his solid chest. She listened to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. She felt safe in the arms of the warlord. A sudden noise shattered the peaceful silence. It was not the sound of a winter storm. It was a long, low blast from a brass war horn. The sound echoed through the Appalachian Valley. Brock stiffened instantly. His arms tightened around her waist. He turned his head toward the wooden window. A second horn blasted. It was closer this time. Christina stepped back. A cold dread settled in her stomach. She looked past his broad shoulder. A bright orange glow flickered through the cracks in the wooden shutters. It was not the light of a setting sun. The sky was burning. Heavy boots pounded against the wooden porch. A fist hammered wildly on the front door. "My lord!" Captain Torrens shouted from the porch. His voice shook with desperate urgency. "The northern banners approach the valley. The High Council has marched on the perimeter." Brock slowly released her. The gentle man vanished. The lethal king returned. He teamed toward the heavy door. His dark eyes blazed with a terrifying, apocalyptic fury. Brock threw the heavy door open. A freezing wind rushed into the small cabin. Stepping onto the wooden porch, he braced his broad shoulders against the bitter cold. Christina followed closely behind him. She stood in the narrow doorway and looked out at the valley. The winter night was no longer dark. A sea of burning torches illuminated the snowy landscape. Hundreds of armored knights formed a tight ring around the wooden fence. Inside the perimeter, the royal vanguard stood in the frozen yard. Captain Torrens held his steel sword ready. His 50 guards faced the vast army of the northern lords. It was a hopeless defensive line. A tall destrier stepped forward through the snowy ranks. The High General rode the massive horse. The slender lord from the winter banquet rode beside him. Both men wore thick armor and confident smiles. They believed they held the ultimate trap. "Call off your vanguard, sire," the High General shouted over the howling wind. "We did not come to spill royal blood. We came to save the realm from ruin." Brock stood at the edge of the wooden porch. He did not draw a steel weapon. Instead, he looked down at the assembled lords with quiet contempt. "You march an army into my valley," Brock stated. His deep voice carried effortlessly across the silent snow. "You surround my loyal vanguard. You bring drawn steel to my home. This is not a rescue mission. This is treason." The northern lord laughed. The harsh sound echoed sharply in the cold air. "Treason?" the noble mocked. "You abandoned the High Council, sire. You left the capital vulnerable to rebel attacks. You rode into the wild mountains for a peasant girl." Raising a leather-gloved finger, the lord pointed directly at Christina. "She has poisoned your mind," the noble accused loudly. "The kingdom requires a strong queen. House Vance offers an iron alliance. We will not let a common seamstress destroy a decade of brutal war." "The realm belongs to me," Brock replied softly. The quiet threat in his tone made the front horses shift nervously. "I built it from scattered ashes. I do not take orders from cowards hiding behind northern gold." The High General raised a steel gauntlet. Taking the signal, the front line of archers drew their wooden bows. The tension in the valley snapped tight. "We are loyal to the crown," the general proclaimed, "but a king must serve his people. We will not leave this valley until the threat to your reign is eliminated." He looked directly at Christina. The implied sentence hung heavy in the winter air. "Give her to us, sire," the general demanded. "Return to Romico Keep, marry Lady Genevieve. Restore the political balance. If you refuse, we will burn this forest to the ground." Christina felt a cold dread settle in her chest. The ambitious lords were willing to start a civil war. They would slaughter Torrin and his loyal men. They would burn the Appalachian woods just to force his hand. Searching for reassurance, she looked at Brock's broad back. He stood like a stone statue against the hostile army. Refusing to glance at the drawn bows, Brock ignored the burning torches. His dark gaze fell to his empty hands. "You give me a final ultimatum," Brock said slowly. "You ask me to choose between the Iron Throne and the woman I claim." "It is the only logical way, sire," the general urged. Turning his head, Brock sought Christina in the doorway. The lethal anger vanished from his dark eyes. He offered her a small smile. It was a private gesture in the middle of a public siege. Facing the traitorous lords again, he reached up with his scarred hand. He grasped the heavy crown resting on his dark hair. With a swift motion, he pulled the crown from his head. A collective gasp rippled through the northern army. The armored lords stared in pure disbelief. The iron crown was the ultimate symbol of supreme authority. Men had died by the thousands to forge it. Brock tossed the metal ring into the snow. It landed with a dull thud. "Then take it," Brock commanded. The snowy valley fell dead silent. Even the winter wind stopped howling. The ambitious lords stared at the discarded crown. They expected a bloody fight. They never anticipated a willing surrender. "You abdicate?" the northern lord whispered. His arrogant smile faltered rapidly. "I choose her," Brock stated simply. "I choose this cabin. I choose peace. You can have the stone keep. You can have the political alliances. Take the empty throne and leave my land." The High General frowned deeply. He looked at the discarded crown, then up at the unarmed king. A dark realization dawned on the veteran commander's face. An alpha king without a metal crown was still an alpha king. The brutal power resided in his wild blood, not in the forged iron. "It is a clever trick," the northern lord hissed. He drew his steel sword. "He will gather the valley loyalists. He will march on us in the spring. We cannot leave them alive." Spurring his tall horse forward, the noble raised his weapon. "Kill the girl! End the royal distraction!" Captain Torrin lunged forward to block the sudden charge. Brock moved much faster. Stepping off the wooden porch, he did not run. He walked with terrifying purpose toward the charging horse. The northern lord swung his steel blade down. Brock dodged the lethal arc with a slight shift of his broad shoulders. Reaching up, he grabbed the leather reins. He twisted his massive wrist violently. The heavy destrier screamed and reared onto its hind legs. Losing his balance, the northern lord fell backward out of his leather saddle. He crashed heavily into the trampled snow. Brock released the frightened horse. Stepping over the thrashing animal, he looked down at the fallen noble. The dark fury returned to his eyes. He reached down and grabbed the lord by his throat guard. Lifting the armored man single-handedly from the snow, he squeezed the metal plating. "I offered you quiet peace," Brock growled. "You chose violence." "Archers!" the High General panted. "Fire!" "No!" Christina screamed. She did not hide inside the safe cabin. Running down the wooden steps, she ignored the sharp pain in her bruised ribs. She ran directly into the dangerous yard. Stepping in front of the kneeling vanguard, she placed herself between the royal archers and the unprotected king. Brock dropped the choking lord instantly. Spinning around, he saw Christina standing in the direct line of fire. Raw panic flashed across his rugged face. "Christina, get back!" he roared. The front archers hesitated. They saw the brave seamstress shielding the fallen king. They saw the sheer terror in the warlord's eyes. This was the legendary monster who had ordered cities burned, yet he was begging a mountain girl to seek shelter. Christina stood tall in the snow. The winter wind whipped her green dress around her ankles. Looking up at the mounted general, she did not show any fear. "You want to save the kingdom?" she yelled. Her clear voice cut through the tense silence. "You think killing me will make him a better ruler?" The general lowered his raised gauntlet a fraction. The royal archers kept their bows drawn but did not loose their deadly arrows. "He is a king of ashes," Christina declared boldly. "He spent 10 years fighting your endless wars. He gave you security, and you reward him with cowardice because he found a single moment of peace." She pointed a trembling finger at the discarded crown in the snow. "He threw away his power for me," she continued. "But if you loose those arrows, he will not die. He will tear this valley apart. He will hunt every single one of you until your noble houses are extinct. Is that the bloody future you want for your realm?" The front soldiers shifted nervously. Glancing at the furious king standing behind the brave girl, they remembered the terrifying legends. They knew she spoke the absolute truth. If they killed her, the Alpha King would become an unstoppable monster. The High General stared at Christina in silence. He saw the fierce devotion burning in her pale eyes. Looking past her at Brock, the commander realized the depth of his mistake. The king had placed himself between the girl and the charging horse without a second thought. The political alliance with House Vance meant nothing against this profound bond. He had tried to break unbreakable steel. Stepping forward, Brock wrapped his arm around Christina's waist. He pulled her against his side. Shielding her body with his own, he glared at the armored general. "Make your final choice, General," Brock warned softly. "Take the Iron Crown and ride north, or loose your arrows and face my wrath." The High General looked at the large army surrounding the small yard. He looked at the discarded crown. He looked at the slender lord groaning in the trampled snow. The political rebellion suddenly felt incredibly foolish. A kingdom built on betrayal would not survive the bitter winter. A low murmur rippled through the front ranks. The royal soldiers slowly lowered their wooden bows. They did not want to fight the Alpha King. They certainly did not want to murder an innocent woman who stood her ground against a charging army. Captain Torrens stepped forward proudly. He raised his steel sword high in the air. "Long live the king!" Torrens shouted. The 50 guards of the vanguard echoed the loud cry. The deafening sound rolled across the snowy valley. Closing his eyes, the High General let out a long sigh. He had lost the political war before a single arrow flew. Raising his gauntlet once more, he signaled the immediate retreat. "Stand down," the general ordered his commanders. His voice carried a tone of deep defeat. The northern army began to slowly lower their drawn weapons. The burning torches flickered in the cold wind. The military siege was breaking. But the political crisis was far from over. Dismounting his tall horse, the High General walked slowly toward the wooden porch. He stopped a few feet away from the iron crown resting in the snow. He looked at the fierce king. He looked at the brave seamstress holding his arm. "We will withdraw tonight, sire," the general said quietly, "but the Northern Council will never accept a commoner as queen. They will demand a trial of blood. They will officially challenge her right to stand beside you." Brock tightened his protective grip on Christina's waist. He did not look at the discarded crown. "Let them challenge us," Brock replied coldly. "We will be ready."
Dawn broke over the Appalachian Valley. The winter storm faded during the night. A pale sun illuminated the trampled snow outside the wooden cabin. The Northern Army had not retreated. They waited at the edge of the dart tree line. Brock stood on the wooden porch. He wore his leather armor. He watched the High General approach on foot. 4 armored guards followed the veteran commander. They carried a heavy stone slab. The guards set the stone down in the center of the snowy yard. The general stepped forward. He carried an iron sword wrapped in dark cloth. He unwrapped the weapon and placed it on the slab. The hilt was forged in the shape of jagged metal thorns. "The trial of blood," the general announced, his breath plumed in the freezing air. "It is an ancient tradition. The Iron Throne demands sacrifice. If the woman claims the right to rule beside the king, she must prove her fortitude." Christina stepped out of the warm cabin. She wore her green dress. She looked at the iron sword resting on the cold stone. "Explain the rules," she requested. Her voice remained calm. The general looked surprised by her steady tone. "You must grasp the thorny hilt with both bare hands. You must lift the heavy blade and hold it toward the morning sky. The metal will pierce your flesh. If you drop the weapon, or if you cry out in pain, you fail. The Northern Council will reject your claim." Brock let out a low snarl. He stepped off the wooden porch. He placed his broad frame between Christina and the stone altar. "There will be no trial," Brock declared. His deep voice shook with suppressed rage. "I will not let you torture her to satisfy your political pride. Take your rusted blade and leave my valley." The general lifted his chin. "Then she remains a commoner, sire. The noble houses will never bow to her. The whispers of civil war will haunt your reign." Brock reached for his own steel sword. He was ready to slaughter the council members where they stood. He preferred a bloody war over watching her suffer. A small hand touched his leather sleeve. Christina stepped around his tall form. She gave him a gentle smile. It was the same reassuring look she had given him when she held the sewing needle in her quiet room. "Let them have their trial," she told him. "No," Brock whispered. Raw panic flashed in his dark eyes. "You do not understand the iron thorns. They are designed to break veteran soldiers. I will not allow it." "I understand pain, Brock," she replied softly. "I understand what it takes to survive in a harsh world. You bled for this kingdom for 10 years. I can bleed for a few minutes to secure our peace." She did not wait for his royal permission. She walked toward the stone slab. The cold snow crutched under her leather boots. The vast army of northern lords watched her in tense silence. They expected the fragile seamstress to weep. They expected her to fail. Christina stopped in front of the stone altar. She looked down at the cruel hilt. The metal spikes looked sharp and unforgiving. She thought about the jagged splinter in Brock's palm. He had sat in perfect silence while she dug into his flesh. He had endured the agony without a single complaint. She could find that same silent strength. She reached out and placed her bare hands over the jagged needle. Taking a slow breath, she squeezed her fingers tight. The sharp points bit immediately into her palms. A harsh sting radiated up her slender arms. She ignored the rising pain. She locked her jaw and pulled the sword upward. The weapon was heavy. Her arms trembled under the physical strain. She lifted the iron blade toward the winter scar. Drops of crimson blood fell onto the white snow. The dark stain spread across the frozen ground. Christina did not drop her gaze. She did not look at her injured hands. She stared directly into the High General's eyes. Her pale face remained stoic. She channeled the quiet dominance of the Alpha King. She held the sword high, refusing to yield to the agony.
The general stared back in disbelief. He saw a peasant girl displaying the resolve of a true conqueror. He realized she possessed a different kind of strength. It was not the brute force of a warrior. It was the unyielding endurance of a mountain survivor. 10 seconds passed, then 20. The silence in the valley grew absolute. The ambitious lords watched the drops of blood fall in steady rhythm. No one spoke. A loud crack shattered the quiet morning. Brock could not endure the sight any longer. He stepped forward and grabbed the steel blade with his leather gauntlet. He ripped the weapon from her grasp, tossing it effortlessly across the yard. He ignored the ancient tradition. The sword crashed into the wooden fence. "The trial is over!" Brock roared. The sheer volume of his voice shook the pine branches. He reached into his dark cloak. He pulled out a clean linen cloth. It was the same fabric she had used to mend his winter armor. He wrapped it carefully around her bleeding palms. His large hands shook slightly as he tied the knot. "You foolish, brave woman," he murmured. He pressed a gentle kiss against her bandaged knuckles. Christina offered a small smile. "I did not cry out." "You never had to prove anything to me," he told her. His rough voice broke with raw emotion. Brock turned his back on her. He walked toward the deep snowdrift near the wooden porch. Reaching down, he pulled the discarded iron crown from the cold snow. He wiped the frost from the dark metal. He walked back to Christina. He stopped in front of her and looked out at the vast army of nobles. He looked at the stunned general. "You wanted a queen," Brock announced to the Silent Valley. "You wanted a ruler who could bear the weight of this harsh realm. You have your answer." He raised the iron crown. With slow reverence, he placed it onto Christina's dark hair. The cold metal settled against her forehead. Brock stepped back. He drew his own steel sword. He did not point it at the northern enemy. He drove the blade deep into the frozen earth. Dropping to one knee in the snow, he bowed his dark head before her. The Alpha King knelt for no one. He had brought hostile nations to ruin rather than submit. Yet here he was, kneeling freely before a mountain seamstress. The High General understood the profound magnitude of the gesture. The political rebellion was dead. The bloody trial had proven her worthy. But the king's willing submission cemented her absolute authority. Drawing his own weapon, the general drove it into the ground. He dropped to his knees in the white snow. "Long live the Queen!" the general shouted. The cry caught like wildfire. Thousands of armored knights drew their weapons. They planted them in the earth. The sound of steel piercing the frozen ground echoed like rolling thunder. A massive wave of soldiers collapsed onto their knees. The arrogant northern lords lowered their heads. The loyal vanguard bowed in unison. The entire kingdom submitted to the woman in the green dress. Christina stood in the center of the yard. She looked at the kneeling army. The terrifying political world no longer intimidated her. She had faced their cruelest trial and survived. She wore the iron crown with quiet dignity. She reached out with her bandaged hand. She touched Brock's broad shoulder. "Rise," she commanded softly. Brock stood up. He left his steel sword buried in the dirt. He looked down at her face. The weary warlord was gone forever. A fierce, joyful light burned in his dark eyes. He had secured his realm, and he had kept his heart. He reached out and pulled her into his arms. He did not care about the thousands of watching eyes. He kissed her beneath the morning sun. It was not a desperate embrace. It was a slow, triumphant promise of a new era. Christina closed her eyes and leaned into his warmth. The bitter Appalachian winter continued to freeze the wild mountains. The political intrigues of the Stone Keep would likely return one day, but they would face those challenges together. The legendary Alpha King had finally found his home, and it was right here, in the quiet strength of the woman who held his heart.
Thank you for joining Brock and Christina's journey. If their story warmed your heart, please subscribe and share your thoughts below. I'd also love to know, where in the world are you listening from today? Leave your footprint. Also, you might have noticed our new narrator for this video. I'd love to hear your honest feedback or any suggestions about the new voice in the comments. See you in the next tale.